Good evening. I'm Jane Shulak, the founder of Culture Lab Detroit, and I'm delighted to be here with you on this first night of our 5-year anniversary program. As many of you know, Culture Lab Detroit is an ongoing conversation and collaboration between Detroit and the international design community. Together, we explore and promote the vital role of culture in the city through exhibitions, public art projects, creative partnerships, and discussions like the one we're about to have. Over the past 5 years, we've looked to designers to inspire us in the most overlooked parts of our lives. We've asked award-winning chefs and landscape architects how to best use our city's green space. We've called upon museum directors and architects to delineate the borders within our culture and society and to provide strategies for transcending them. This year, we brought a wonderful group of artists and thinkers to discuss the theme of post-truth. Some of you may know that post-truth was the Oxford English Dictionary's 2016 Word of the Year. It's a word that describes a peculiar time in our world, a time in which objective facts have less bearing on public opinion than appeals to emotion do. Though the word has gotten a lot of airtime in our recent political climate, it's by no means new. The condition described as post-truth has long been the dwelling space of artists. This year's program asks how art can help us all navigate a world in which facts are open for interpretation. Tonight's discussion, alternative facts, is another phrase you've heard quite a lot this year, but unlike the usage that came from the White House, we're not blurring the line between true and false. Rather, we're talking with people whose work, through historic research, making new connections between the past and the present, and building physical spaces for the marginalized, provide fact-based alternatives. The participants in this discussion explore different versions of history, ways of existing in America today, and possibilities for the future. Allow me to introduce our esteemed guests this evening. Multimedia artist Edgar Arceneaux investigates patterns of history through drawings, sculpture, installations, and multimedia events. Among his most acclaimed work is the compelling reenactment of Ben Vereen's tragically misunderstood blackface performance at Ronald Reagan's 1981 inaugural gala. Across all of Edgar's creations, he connects seemingly disparate elements such as science fiction, civil rights speeches, techno music, and the architecture of Detroit, ultimately pointing to larger historical forces. Brothers Christopher and Dominic Leong comprise the award-winning New York architecture and design firm Leong, focusing on projects that envision new relationships between culture and commerce, public and private, figure and field, mundane and monumental. Notable projects include the design for the Los Angeles LGBT Center's Anita Mae Rosenstein campus in Hollywood and the new Center for Community and Entrepreneurship for Asian Americans for Equality in Flushing, New York. Martine Syms uses video and performance to examine representations of Blackness and its relationship to American situational comedy, Black vernacular, feminist movements, and radical traditions. Her artwork has been exhibited extensively and screened extensively, including presentations at New York's Museum of Modern Art, the New Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and the MCA Chicago. And our moderator, Juanita Moore, who is the president and CEO of the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History right here in Detroit, home to the largest permanent exhibit on African American culture in the world. Prior to assuming the helm of this critically important institution, Moore served as executive director of the American Jazz Museum and the Gem Theater in Kansas City, and was the founding executive director of the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, where she oversaw the construction of the museum located at the site of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Now here's a bit more about each of our guests in their own words. So no doubt we are in for an interesting evening. But before we begin our program, I want to pause to thank Simeon Heyer for sharing the jam handy with us, David Stark Design for their vision, our wildly helpful volunteers, and the awe-inspiring Culture Lab Detroit team that made this evening possible. Thank you, Milana, Megan, Tricia, and Andrea. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. You're just as much a part of this program as anybody up on the stage. So now please, without further ado, help me welcome our moderator and panelists.
Wow. Good evening. I too want to really say how pleased I am to be here and thank all of you for coming and say that, Jane has done an amazing job and I want to thank her for the opportunity to be here. So can you help me thank Jane? Well, I got an opportunity to meet these guys earlier, and we've, been joking a little bit about some of the things that we were going to do up here. So, but I just want to tell them right now in front of all of you, I lied. I'm going to do exactly what Jane said. But we are looking forward to a very interesting and honest and open conversation. And I know that no matter what I ask them, I said to them, no matter what I ask, I know that really great things will come out of their mouths. And if it's not, I'll just go like, keep coming, until something does, because it's in them. But before we get started to talk about, your crafts for each of one of you, why don't we take a moment to really reflect on the topic tonight, post-truth. For the, post-truth, alternative facts, fake news, horrible. And so I'd like to sort of start with having an opportunity to have each of you talk about how the language of today's political landscape has made into the conversation around your art. I said I would call on the person who's not really looking at me, Edgar.
Yeah, you want me to answer that question? How does?
Well, I want all of you to sort of respond to it, but we'll start with you.
Okay, repeat the question one more time.
We talked about the fact that we have all these words, alternative facts, fake news, and but how has this language of today's political landscape sort of made it into your work?
I was here maybe 5 years ago, and Cornelius Harris, who's one of the managers at Underground Resistance, whose studio is just right down the street, sent me this video called The Century of the Self. Are you guys familiar with this documentary? Who directed that?
Curtis.
Adam Curtis. Are you guys familiar with this documentary, Adam Curtis? So to put it in a nutshell, I mean, the term alternate fact is really a public relations spin on fiction, right? And in this documentary, it outlines the way in which Edward Bernays, who is the founder of the term public relations, is actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Edward Bernays realized that the term propaganda had gotten a bad rap because of the Nazis during World War II, and thought that it needed a new term. So public relations was the term that was created to replace propaganda. But the way in which he used Freud's ideas was to take away the idea of marketing and selling people stuff, but to sell them the idea of a thing, right? So planned obsolescence could be built in to something that you can sell to another person. So really what you were selling them was an idea of a thing, not necessarily the thing itself. So when I think about the term alternate facts, so that I don't give any real power to that mad person, Kellyanne Conway, I think about it more in that place where art and alternate facts meets, which is in the space of fiction. In the political sense, that fiction is a way of producing a sense of wholeness within the political process. Now that we know for certain that the Russians hacked the election and that Facebook was a powerful tool for producing these false narratives, I like to think about the alternate fact more in the place in which it meets art, so we could think about fiction in relationship to poetics. Right. So in my work, I'm oftentimes taking something for granted and then trying to figure out a way of decentering it and showing it to you from a different perspective so that you can actually see it differently. So in the project that I did about Ben Vereen and his performance in blackface, most people engage with the subject primarily through a moral lens. They're like, all those poor people who did blackface. So what I tried to do in the play was to decenter the subject of the blackface by pushing it to the side and then telling the story from the perspective of how Ben Vereen experienced it, which is today as a series of traumas, right? So, and within the play that I wrote, I'm trying to place you inside of a dream, more or less, and then showing you that missing 5 minutes of the performance that America never got to see, but that was recorded, right? So my interest in the false is oftentimes to show you what you think is the truth, and then turn it to the side so you can see it fresh, sort of all over again. Ideally, so you can see yourself in it, right? So you can see how it is a part of your history, how you are reflected in it at the same time.
Okay. Christopher?
I wasn't looking, so you called me.
I told you I would do that.
Yeah, I was trying to look at you. I think it was interesting, one of the things that Jane pointed out in this idea of this definition of post-truth as being this context that it exists somewhat in a kind of emotional thing. It's sort of a triggering thing, and it's, you bring up this idea of propaganda, right? And so I think we live in a world, I think so much we live in a world that's inundated and filtered by our technology, and really like our screens, which is sort of a filtering lens for how we understand the world. And I think, what that really does is produces a lot of understanding of the world through fragments, right? So the context, the actual way that the world is, what's happening in the world is being constantly kind of presented through these fragments that are put out there. And that's what we see, and that's sort of I feel is this context of this constant world of spin, of things sort of always sort of being put out there. And it's a very emotional time, I feel that. This has been like an emotional year, even down to like Prince going and like hurricanes, and like the world seems like it's collapsing. But like, I think reflecting on what that means is sort of when this idea, this state of post-truth, it feels that, everything is a little bit chaotic. And what does that mean when there is no consistency of what truth really is? And how that kind of reflects back into our own conversations about our work and what architecture is that if there's no constant of what truth is, then all you can sort of turn to is what your own truth is. And I think for me personally, that's about a kind of searching of like a ground and trying to find what that greater context is. So trying to think through what architecture can do to serve the city we live in, the community, the people. It's about a pursuit of what those projects are, and going away from the direction of the surface and the fragments, and trying to find things that actually are real and feel real. So that's sort of my thing.
Okay. Martine, you have such beautiful language. So
I guess my relationship to the idea of post-truth or this alternative facts is also thinking about some of what Edgar's saying of it as a kind of fiction or an imaginative kind of speculative space where you can think about what you'd like to happen. Oh, I'm feeding back. But also, I'm particularly interested in the way that the disjointed, kind of fragmented nature of the way we live kind of through screens, and really that as a kind of cinematic space of our experience of, the messages we share, the kind of media that we share with each other, as well as the internet, or navigating digital spaces at the same time that we're navigating like physical spaces, and the kind of simultaneity of that. Where is like the continuity in that, and where is the kind of ground, I guess is the term, to use the term that you used for, like if you think of a kind of cinematic language and continuity editing, the way that we're experiencing all that media at once joins it all together. And I think for many people, in a political sense, whether you call it propaganda or whatever term you use, this kind of obfuscation of information has always been used to maintain power. And so there's always been a questioning of that by many different groups, and a lot of those inheritances I feel invested in these kind of radical traditions, regardless of kind of where they came from, politics, music, art. We're always kind of questioning what was presented as the truth, because this idea of a truth is always used kind of to oppress people. And so I'm interested in how those people kind of find continuity in disjuncture, and that's something that orients a lot of the aesthetics of my work, of using fragments or using many different images kind of happening simultaneously.
Dominic.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, even before being an architect, the use of language seems increasingly important. When it's sort of when in a sense the kind of common associations with meaning for certain words are challenged in and of themselves, it reaffirms actually how important language is. And that's, I think, been really brought to bear on all of us, and I think it's actually a very, very challenging time in that sense, that in a way, the language in the way that it can kind of create a commonality between people, when that drops out, when that's actually strategically pulled apart for the sake of creating chaos, it presents a kind of very dynamic situation in which we all have to figure out how to navigate that and how to find meaning within a very kind of liquid sort of environment. And I think in terms of how that relates to architecture, I think even before it's about making architecture, it's really coming to terms with how you situate yourself within this, a culture that the kind of poles of values are shifting so dramatically. And in a way, it almost makes me think we have to go back to the basics and sort of reassess the values that are a common ground between all of us, and that those seem actually very much up in the air at this point in time. But then when I think about architecture, I think about the need to provide coherence, and even if it's like a temporary sense of coherence, that's actually a very powerful thing that architecture, I think, can do. In a sense, even just bringing us into this space and allowing that to happen is really important, I think.
Okay. And as we talk about alternative facts, why don't we sort of focus on that first word first? And I want you to talk a bit about how the search for alternatives have informed your practices, each of you. The search for alternatives instead of just focus on just that word.
I think for us at our practice, so we've been working on the largest LGBT campus probably in the world, and it was a project that started in 2014, and I think we've sort of we never really set out to explore alternatives, but I think when you're confronted with opportunities or challenges, somehow your values just start to express themselves. And I think this project is really important. It was a competition. We thought there's no way we were going to win. We're this young firm, but it was so important to us because we thought it just needed to exist. The kind of confluence of what we were interested in, what we think architecture is capable of doing, in that particular case, providing almost like a civic voice for the LGBT community within the city of Los Angeles, was an opportunity that we didn't necessarily make, but the organization, the nonprofit organization, produced, sort of got to a stage of having the ability to make this community present in a way that had never been before. We just, in a way, they made this alternative, and we just stepped in to try to facilitate that, realize that, and basically translate that into having a civic presence. So,
Edgar, what about you? How has the search for alternatives inform your practices?
Well, I'm thinking about that question. What does that mean exactly, alternatives? Is it I think to myself, are we talking about what's the alternative to Coke is Pepsi? Right? I mean, because that's essentially how it's working politically, is to say, well, you may not like this fact, but why don't we offer you another one that might feel better, right? I mean, that's kind of the. But anyway, I'm trying to get away from that to talk about it more in the place where it meets hard. And I wanted to say something about serendipity. Anybody here believe in coincidence and chance? They think it's a powerful force. There's a few of us. Oddly enough, there's almost all of them are on this side of the room. Is that a coincidence? Did you guys all decide subconsciously to congeal? But when I did this project that was looking at these two letters that was about Martin Luther King and his family, it was a coincidence that I found the first one, because it was in an article online that the FOA, the Freedom of Information Act, had released this letter that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had sent to Martin Luther King. It's commonly known as a suicide letter. Are you guys familiar with the suicide letter? I mean, essentially, it was sent, it's supposed to be sent in the vernacular of a black person to speak up. Oh, I'm not speaking loud enough. Really? Oh, you guys can't hear me? You can't hear me, or you cannot? You can. In the back you can hear me. Okay. Is that a political symbol? Speak up? Oh, okay. Be more like this. Okay. Yeah. I will do my best. I'm a little even-tempered, so. But the letter basically was sent to Dr. King in 1964 that told him that we know your secrets, we know what you've been up to, and at the end it said you should basically kill yourself. The letter, when it was released to the public, was highly redacted, but essentially the redacted part was supposed to outline some evidence of his extramarital affairs. It was a bit of a surprise to me to find out that indeed Martin Luther King did have some weakness, and it was not alcohol. It was women, supposedly. And the FBI had recordings of this, and they were blackmailing him because they didn't want him to receive the Nobel Peace Prize that he was going to be receiving a few months later. But almost 50 years to the day of him receiving that letter, a second letter came out from Bernice King, his daughter, saying that her two brothers, Martin Luther King III, ironically, and Lester, were suing her because they wanted to sell the Nobel Peace Prize and the Bible to a private collection, but she didn't want to give it to them, right? So I asked myself, I was like, well, what is it that happened between, 2014 and 1964, where the Nobel Peace Prize went from being a tool for social uplift, and then it became a relic that they felt like it needed to be sold, even though it was the exact same metal in the exact same book, right? So serendipity allowed me an alternative way to think about history, right? Because the thing that changed that object was not the greed of the brothers and the sister, but it was the forces of economics itself that was transforming it, because after Dr. King died, it gained a level of cachet, right? So then you have this family that are fighting each other in a way in which is really shameful to think that they went to court. By the way, Bernice lost. I don't know if you guys kept up with the case. And the prize was given and the Bible was given back to the brothers, and I guess they've sold it by now as well.
Dexter and Martin.
Yeah. So, I mentioned the story, if you guys haven't figured it out by now, I'm a little long-winded. I will try to get to the point a little sooner, just because I want to respect my fellow panelists. But the point is that I'm trying to get at is that we can get nostalgic about facts as well, because we've rendered Martin Luther King and his family as a kind of our royal family. So we don't want to think that these kinds of conflicts that are happening inside of their home. But it was clear that there was conflict that was happening on three levels. There was conflict on the level of the individual, where Martin Luther King was his actions were in conflict with his moral principles. You had the conflict on the level of the family, in which the family is fighting with each other over these objects. And then it's reflected within society as a whole, or within the social body. Right? So part of what I'm trying to get at with this long story is that I think that the reason why politically alternate facts are so powerful is because we do live within a culture that values certain kinds of myths and certain kinds of narratives over some of the harder truths. Right? But the poetics of art can give you a sense of being able to see a window through time, so that you can imagine what your role is in it within the present moment. That's what I'm always trying to do, is to get people to understand their power within the present moment right now.
Okay. Great. I'm going to have to remember that you're long-winded, and I'm going to do like that.
Oh, but that wasn't long. What was I talking for? What, like
you told me
2 minutes?
Is
that 2 minutes? I was going for... Actually, Suzanne Lacey, who's in the front, and I teach, so she can be the one who'll tell me if I go over. She does it regularly in the classroom, so...
Okay, I depend on you. Martine, I'm going to come back to you. In the Mundane's Afrofuturistic manifesto, you recognize and rejoice in the awesome power of the Black imagination. How do you draw from Afrofuturism to imagine alternative narratives and new future within your practice?
Good question. Well, for me, I think like the idea of Afrofuturism, I wrote that text, this Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto, in direct reference to this Mundane Science Fiction Manifesto, which was sort of about, essentially, if people are constantly thinking about placing their narratives in other planets and solar systems, and it kind of had an environmental subtext, basically considering things are strange enough on Earth. And I was kind of following that, and so I believe it was Greg Tate that said this, that was like, Black life is science fiction, that there's already strange activities that are going on, and notes. It was in an essay I read by Kodo Shan, and I was sort of taking that as the starting place for this idea of the mundane, and thinking about that if the mundane, if you look at that realm, sort of what you do every day, the things you do the most, that's like a dynamic site of where change happens, like where you really see the most change. It's even something like, I don't know, Tesla, let's say.
The car or the scientist?
The car.
Oh, okay.
Electric vehicles. Like only some people are using that, but that technology has been around for a while, or FaceTime or whatever it is. But when everybody, like the kind of baseline is changing, that's like a site that I'm very interested in how that changes, like kind of what you're asking, what happens between 1964 and 2014 on the everyday level. And so I was thinking about, inspired by the mundane science fiction writers, what would a mundane kind of Afrofuturism look like, and what would thinking about some of the, I was writing this sort of around, Trayvon Martin's murder And I was thinking a lot about these, if you just go out to the grocery store, or you're just doing something very regular, and something totally tragic and crazy happens, basically, and how those things happen all the time, or your day can radically shift in a moment. And I was thinking what that looked like aesthetically, and sort of what that would mean for a way of making work, and using Afrofuturism as a kind of methodology, I guess. And for me, a lot of that is thinking about this relationship just between history and the inheritances, or how to use a technology in a way that it wasn't intended for. Maybe this poetics, bringing a kind of poetics into my use of technology. And the archive, and sort of where, again, kind of forcing a continuity where it's not immediately present.
Do people know that you're a programmer, and that you designed websites in the past, and that you have this background?
I mean, now they do.
Now they don't. That was to be a secret. But she lives in the digital. She lives in the space between the real and the digital. So I don't know if people had.
I think everybody does, but I do more. I'm a power user, I guess. But yeah, I think that also influences a lot of mine, just being a very regular and intensive user of technology, but always being interested in it from a perspective of just wanting to make stuff, or wanting to change how something looked or functioned, and that really driving my investigation of the web, and I think I just kind of was between this cusp. I noticed a generational shift, especially with social media, because I'm really just going to talk about LiveJournal right now for a second, which was a blogging platform and community. Maybe some of you know about it. I made a lot of good friends on there, people I'm still friends with. But with something like LiveJournal, you could still modify. If you wanted to change anything on it, you needed to know how to code, and you needed to modify your code. And even a few years later than when you had a platform like Facebook where you couldn't change things, that was really formative for me. You're talking about searching for alternatives. I think I just had an inclination to want to have something my own way, and would always search for the way to do that. And whether that was through making music, or finding certain music, or connecting with people online to find music, or it was always driven by a kind of search for an alternative.
How does that sort of fit with you also being an entrepreneur?
Well, I think the entrepreneurial side was directly a result of graduating into the Great Recession. So I was very involved in independent music and independent kind of film communities in Los Angeles, which I was very fortunate to find at a really young age. So I worked 3 places that I feel like were very formative. I worked at the Echo Park Film Center, which is a kind of community co-op, film co-op, micro cinema, and film school. I worked at The Smell, which was an all-ages music venue, and at Ooga Booga, which was a store that sold artist books, among other things. And my, kind of introduction to the idea of just selling something was really from, you make something, you want somebody else to see it. And so, that's really what oriented me. So then once I graduated from school, I think I had a job for a couple of months, but at the same time as I had a job, I started a project space in Chicago where I sold records and clothes and things that my friends and people I met on the internet were making. And
what was it called again?
Golden Age. It was called Golden Age. And it was going, so this was 2007. We did one art fair. We sold a bunch of stuff, and we were like, oh my God, you can make money doing art. So we quit our jobs, and then we're never able to find jobs again. So I had to figure it out.
Well, you got a job now. Well, you teach now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you
like,
forgot
what?
about that? You got a job, yeah. It was in the
do.
newspaper. Yeah, they mentioned that. Yeah.
But it took a while.
Teaching job.
It took a while.
Can I just add to that? I think one thing that's interesting, what you're describing is this sort of way communities and collectivities are formed through your own kind of life experience, and that's something that we actually Chris and I talk a lot about relative to like space and architecture. Because in a way, like we sort of straddle like pre-internet, post-internet. And now I think it's really fascinating because at one point you could say, and this ties back into like the alternatives conversation, space was sort of the primary medium of organizing people, information, and power. And now that's obviously shifted to like the internet and social media. So it's like when you come back to space, what do you need in order to enable these kind of online communities to manifest in physical space? So what are the alternatives that we need to invent in order to, in a way, explore how we relate in space now, which is really different. So I think there's a whole conversation about alternatives of types of space and how we actually relate it. And I actually think, for example, Charlottesville is like a really interesting case study in that because the city itself became the sort of first manifestation of this kind of collective of white supremacist and not so much in a necessarily positive sense, but I think that kind of role of space is actually getting played out in a lot of other kind of situations, and it's a really kind of different world we live in terms of how we kind of come together and how that creates space that actually allows an identity to like solidify, whether it's positive or negative.
Edgar, you had mentioned earlier about the film Until.
Can you just ask me a yes or no question? No.
Sassy.
I could, but you wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't say yes or no.
Well, except for, yeah.
If I did, you would explain. So why not go? Why do that dance? Let's just go for this. You talked about this, the movie that you did. Could you talk to us a little bit about the incident and exactly, why you found it important to do the film?
Yeah. Well, life is funny. So, we all have our taboos, there's some people in here be like, I'm never going to make anything about religion, or I'm never going to do anything about rape, or I'm never going to do anything that includes, Jesus in it or the Sistine Chapel. Everybody has their taboos of their cultural producers, and mine was blackface. Because there were other people that were investigating race and stereotypes, and I thought they were doing a fine job. And I didn't really see a space for myself in that exploration, at least as far as like specifically trying to engage with race as a subject for my artwork. But by chance, I saw this performance of Ben Vereen doing a blackface performance that's part of a documentary. I actually went to the bathroom, and when I came back, it was on, and I was like, what is this? And why have I never heard about Ben Vereen and blackface and Ronald Reagan? Like, how did this happen? It was, and I don't even remember what the documentary was. But oh man, I'm going long again. Okay. Anyway, so to try to sum it up, so that was about 20 years ago when I saw that, and I was never able to forget about it. It was very powerful. It was very emotional. It was very moving. And I was with some friends, and they went to a birthday party, a kid's birthday party, which I was not invited to, 5-year-old's party. And I'm standing in line to get a hot dog, and who's sitting there but Ben Vereen? And I'm like, oh my God, So, and I had been commissioned to do a performance piece for Performa about a year before, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I said, well, go talk to Ben Vereen. I'm not shy when talking to celebrities. I live in Los Angeles. We encountered them often. And he was very nice. And then I mentioned the 1981 performance, and his whole demeanor changed. So, I convinced him to meet with him, and when I sat down and he told me the story about what had happened to him in his life, because I didn't know that back part, then I realized it was this invisible part of history that had an impact not only on him, but on all of us. Ben Vereen is a national treasure, and his disappearing from the scene was partially to do with a performance that nobody ever saw. So I said, well, let's bring this into the present. And then try to tell the story in a way which can take the blackface and move it from the center so that you can see it fresh again.
So how did Ben Vereen actually react to you doing this? I know he was grateful, but did it have subsequent influences on his ability to be able to really sort of get his career back on track?
I can't take much credit for that. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw Rocky Horror Picture Show on Fox. He was in that. His career is upticked around the same time that we were engaging with each other, but I can't take any credit for that part of it. But he did come and see the show in June. And he called me, and he was like, hey, Edgar, did you get my text? And I said, no. He said, well, listen, Liza Minnelli wants to come and see the show. Can I get 4 tickets? And I was like, I'm sorry. You can't just tell me Liza Minnelli's coming with you to see the show, because he hadn't seen it either, and it was his first time seeing it. And he sat in the front row with her, and she was like, there's always one person in a play that is really into it, and they're like, ooh, like they're kicking it. That was her. That was Liza Minnelli. And afterwards, he made this really powerful speech, and it was very, very moving. And as a reward, he came back 2 days later and then tried to rewrite my show. No, jokes aside, he did come back, and it was wonderful. And we worked on some scenes together and danced together. So.
Oh, you dance?
Well, my actor danced. I watched, and then they danced.
We're going to put you to work. Christopher, whether it's designing a new maximum security prison or a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, architects are often deeply entangled in the socio-political struggles of the day. How does your firm negotiate these issues?
It's a good question. I think it's an important question. I mean, architecture is unique in that I don't consider it an art. I think it's, architects work for power structures. Architecture takes a lot of time and resources and labor to produce, and inherently in that, you're confronted with dealing with, governments or very wealthy individuals or, a lot of different people. So that's what makes architecture really complicated. And I think in our own practice, we do kind of confront a lot of situations where sometimes you have to make a choice. There was a project that we recently did and are working on. It's a senior affordable housing project in Lower Manhattan. And it was a situation where we were on sort of both sides of the equation. It's a project within our community. It's like a block away from our office. And it's a site that's, it's owned by the city, but and it was privately held for a really long time, but, and it kind of grew up. There's big trees that kind of grew through there and sculptures that are in there. And within the past 3 years, it sort of became a community garden. And so it's sort of this treasured thing within the neighborhood. And, as people, that was always an important space in the city for us. But unknowingly, there's also, the city owns the site, and there's an affordable housing crisis in New York, just like there is in many other cities, right? It's not like Detroit, there's not a lot of real estate, right? So when you have an opportunity to create housing, and that's a major initiative and something we're very interested in, then that becomes a thing. What do you do in that situation? So then someone approached us and said, and so on one hand, we were supporting the garden and trying to figure out how to preserve it. On the other hand, we realized the city was trying to develop the site and trying to produce senior affordable housing. There were 60,000 applicants for 300 senior affordable housing units in Lower Manhattan in the last year. So someone came to us, a non-for-profit developer, and said, do you guys want to engage in this? Because, if we don't do anything, someone's going to do something terrible, and we know that what's going to happen there is going to be worse than what we could, than what was there. So we were kind of confronted with that choice of like, how do you engage and what do you engage? And that was a situation in which I think the space is beautiful, and if it were an option, and we thought about this a lot, to develop another, a lot of people ask, well, the city owns other sites, well, can't they develop other sites? But it's also a situation of, well, there's a need right now for people and for the city, and it's an opportunity. So we kind of evaluated it and said, well, look, if we participate, then we want to participate and break the rules, because if we follow the rules, we destroy something that's there. If we break the rules, there's an opportunity to produce something new. It's not undeveloped, but it's a potential to produce something new, which would be to take part of that lot and give it over to a community garden and have it be stewarded by people from the community. And so that was this kind of interesting moment of trying to think about how you engage and how you produce something that produces an alternative. And I think that's this idea that within this context, the idea is that there's a garden space that we don't design, we don't have a design for it, it's designed with the community. We have a landscape partner that facilitates this, and we were engaged in it. We ask people, what do you want? And that's the idea about that space. And then the whole ground floor becomes part of a community space, a senior center, a non-for-profit arts organization that can curate the things. And then what's on top is living for seniors, who then also get like a south-facing facade that looks down into this garden, and they don't feel alienated and they feel connected. So that was an interesting opportunity to think about how you can engage in a project, but also dealing with the kind of that entanglement. I don't know if it's hard to say what's the right thing to do a lot of times in architecture.
I think there's also just the power of no. When you don't agree with the way the project is set up or the intentions behind it, you can always just, a maximum security prison. What are the intentions behind this project? What are the contexts in which you're operating? What kind of power do you have within that context? And does that align with your own values? And if it doesn't, then you just say no.
I guess that flows right into the next question that I was going to ask you, Dominic.
Okay.
Because, you've spoken about the fact that you did the LBGT Center in LA, and I know you also did the Asian Americans for Equity, mm-hmm. and then the seniors place that you were just speaking of. Do you search out partners with progressive politics, or is just people come, that's just who you are, so people know to search you?
No, it's actually kind of funny because our practice started off doing more kind of art installations and actually doing fashion retail projects. Our background is working on larger kind of cultural projects. And these, in a way, architecture is interesting because you don't, it's about translating, opportunities that come to you. It's very rare that an architect actually self-initiates a project and, sets it up. So, in a sense, we just saw these kind of situations or these projects on the horizon, and we just gravitated towards them, and almost not even like consciously saying we need to do socially progressive architecture, but they just seemed like important projects that needed to exist. And I think we've realized that what attracted us to these projects was that like Asian Americans for Equality or the LGBT community are communities that historically have not had the opportunity to create architecture, and that the sort of social progress that they have achieved over the last 20, 30 years actually has put them in the position to make architecture. So from a kind of designer's point of view, and also from this kind of point of view of alternates, we're fascinated in how do you translate social organizations that have yet to find a voice in the city. And I think that's a super exciting way to sort of position what we think architecture can actually do. So it just kind of evolved out of just practicing and encountering these organizations, and somehow it just made sense.
Martine, your practice incorporates the use of found imagery and footage. How does this does the material serve as what Alison Landsberg describes as prosthetic memory? Are you basically working off of your memories, or is it the collective memories of the African American experience?
More recently, I've been, I guess, interested in like shooting a lot more work. So most recently, like over the summer, I had an exhibition that was at the Museum of Modern Art that was centered around a film that was 72 minutes. That one kind of main character was very inspired by found footage and material that I found from Maxine Powell, who was very kind of formative figure at Motown. And before that, I guess I was working much more with found material, whether that was photographs, kind of my own family kind of archive, found photographs that I would collect at flea markets and things like that, or film that I would digitize, taking archival material and editing that work together. But I've always, as I was doing that, kind of been interested in making things that looked like they were from a past, I guess, like that they could be hidden or seem like they'd come from a kind of archive, even if they hadn't. And I think that was part of this idea of this prosthetic memory, which is this term that Alison Landsberg uses just to describe all of the media that we have access to, and sort of how it becomes a part of us and how we negotiate that as a kind of viewer and use it.
Can you say that one more time? Repeat that one more time.
Which part?
The last part. The what you just...
Maybe I'll continue and then it'll
It'll
start to
up.
click.
Okay. All right.
Because I think the key word in it is this prosthetic, that it's a kind of prosthetic that you could like hook on, like if you think of a prosthetic arm or something, that it's a kind of type of memory. Like you talked about these certain myths that are more valuable than others.
Yeah.
And I feel like within popular culture, it's a clear way to see at certain times which stories, which narratives we are more invested in than others. And that's like a way that I kind of orient thinking about history is through this media as like a material history. So what are the context of certain video quality or film, and some people can really quickly identify like the time period of a certain image. If you show like a family photo that's from the 70s, it's not just what's in the image, it's also the sort of photo, the color, the grain, and so forth, that tells you that kind of time period. So I use that in terms of thinking about the setting more imaginatively, or kind of placing things into that framework. And then, I don't know, just as I become more ambitious, and what I'm excited about right now is, it's kind of combining those and using those as source material, but really writing a lot more and working with performers, but still trying to have this kind of reality to it. So I don't know, I like tricking people, I guess, in a way, of thinking that it's something that's found. I haven't quite figured out what I like so much about that, but I get a deep satisfaction from someone thinking that it was, I had found it in a thrift store or something.
Okay. Edgar, you work across a number of mediums. How do you choose which medium that you're going to use for a specific topic or theme that you're working with?
Certain ideas lend themselves better to certain kinds of expressions, So, making a play was something that making a musical is weird for me because I don't like musicals, right? So I don't know if there's any theater people, and I don't want to insult anybody, but musicals, at least like 2 years ago, musicals to me weren't cool. Right, but then I wound up making one, right? So part of the desire of to make art is also about putting yourself in the situation where you can embrace the spirit of a beginner. So like every time you do something new, you're constantly struggling with the material, and ideally, that's a way of moving past or beyond certain kinds of conventions, because if you don't know the rules, then it's easy to move beyond them.
Seems like you keep talking about things you said you would never do, and then everything you do.
Am I repeating myself?
I mean, that's the second time, but it's interesting that like you're like, I hate musicals, so I made a musical.
I made one. Yeah.
I never wanted to do blackface, so I did a project on blackface. Like, I think that's an interesting moment of maybe doing, I don't know what it is. I'm curious about that.
There's a quote that I find inspiring from James Baldwin, and just to paraphrase, and you guys may know this, but he said something along the lines of, he was talking about the process of writing and the kind of agony that he experiences when he does it, and he described it as being akin to having a toothache. So he said, that there's the pain that happens from having a toothache, but your body says to you, if you ignore me, then I'm going to kill you, right? So he says that in the process of creating, when you experience pain or discomfort, oftentimes it means that it's sitting outside of your own good taste and form, and that you should actually run directly towards that pain, right? So like the discomfort zones, I say it jokingly, but I do try to stay attuned to them, right? I try to see like, why don't I feel good about this? Because oftentimes it's just your subconscious trying to tell you, hey, you're ignoring something which could be very advantageous.
That was good.
Succinct, as if everything else wasn't. But it just sort of, just like it's like an ant, it wanders around, it gets there, there's a little journey involved.
Okay, this is for Christopher and Dominic. Truth to materials is a tenet of modern architecture. Can you propose something like post-truth to materials? Just kidding. He was going to answer. Okay, but really, do you see that this social moment leading to any new trends in architecture, the current social moment we're in?
Can I answer that? I think
yes.
Post-election, I think for everyone it was an incredible wake-up call, and also for architecture. And almost going back to what Chris was saying about when the ground is totally liquefied and you don't know where you're standing, then the only place you can really look is like inside, and like speak to your own truth, and that allows you in a way to relate to other people's truths. And in a sense, I feel like what I'm interested in seeing in the architecture community is a kind of process of self-reflection, and to really, because actually we've had these conversations with other colleagues, and architecture sometimes thinks, we're so progressive, like like there's just an assumption that architecture is this kind of progressive creative industry, like within our kind of specific community. But then if you really, really think about it, you're like, is that true? Is that really true? Like you start looking at the demographics of the offices and the people who work there, and you're like, does this demographic actually reflect a progressive culture? And does it reflect a culture that we think we're actually in service of? So I think architecture is going through a kind of process of self-reflection and honesty about what it, who are we, and who do we want to work with and for. And even like the AIA, the American Institute for Architects, they came out after the election with a very kind of lukewarm, almost supportive statement towards the administration.
Really controversial, right? Like a lot of people were really pissed off.
Yeah, and I think a lot of architects came out and like, this organization doesn't speak for the entire profession or discipline, and it was a huge controversy. And I mean, the good thing about it is like the architects, made a fuss about it, and then the AIA kind of had to deal with that and backtrack and sort of come to terms with that. And then they eventually, I think, invited Michelle Obama to speak at the AIA convention in Miami. So, I think it's inspiring to see, in a way the profession and also the younger generation within architecture take a political position, and which even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I don't think it was as present.
I think just to add to that quickly, I think the the trend in architecture. I mean, I think in a lot of ways architecture is in some ways in a crisis. I think architecture moves so slow for a world that actually moves very, very fast. So the profession is in a lot of ways at a crossroads. But I think, and it kind of actually dovetails a little bit with Martine, like the way you work and practice and talking about this idea of conceptual entrepreneurism, that seeking alternatives or seeking things that you want to create in the world, I don't think historically architecture has been in a place to do that. I think architecture is historically a place where a power structure says this is what's needed, and then the architecture is kind of waiting there and saying, okay, tell me what to do. But I think that the thing that's changing is this idea that in an entrepreneurial mindset or in a kind of idea of seeking alternatives, that there can be more self-initiated projects. And I think that's what you see in Detroit. And I think that's why Detroit kind of represents kind of a very aspiring moment, because people are out there trying to create the world and the community that they want to operate in, whatever field you're in. And so in New York, you see this more. There's our friends are developing a pool that is in the shape of a plus that is a crazy idea that's actually becoming real. And they were raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this and trying to work with organizations to place this thing in the river. And that's a very different model than I think has existed historically. So I think that's a trend I think that you will see.
I have a final question.
I just had one more thing, because I wanted to actually connect it back to you, because it's really nice to be on stage in conversation with artists. And I think the other thing that I find interesting now is a lot of times I think architecture sort of inhabits two poles. One is sort of the aesthetic practice of architecture, and then the social practice. And I think it's increasingly interesting to actually get out of that dichotomy and try to merge aesthetics and social practice within architecture. So, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you guys talk about your work, because in a way it already kind of it does that inherently. And I think that's like super inspiring. So I think that's like, looking towards like art and similar practices of trying to figure out how to sort of capture the energy of aesthetics, but also like having a kind of social practice with it.
I have a final question for all of you, and we're going to let Edgar go last, because
You can let me go first, and then everybody.
for you it's a yes or no. For everyone else, they get
Right.
No. Does the artist have a moral imperative to be politically engaged?
I guess I'll just answer that, because I was just thinking when you guys were talking about, it's something I think about art a lot as well. I'm like, there's this presumption that it has this radical politics, when I find that the more institutionalized or institutional support I get, the more I don't find that. And the demographics, all the things that you basically outlined as far as architecture taking a look at itself, I feel like that's how I feel about the art world very much. And so I think that drives a lot of my participation in collaborations with other people, like collaborations within musicians, or finding or being drawn to kind of having an alternative artist-run spaces that were retail spaces, looking in fashion or these kind of other places where I'm also working, because I want to bring two different audiences, a very specific audience that comes to an art museum or an art gallery, and I'm interested in not just talking to that audience, and who else can I bring into that space? And that's something that I'm always thinking about. And whether I'm thinking about that directly, I don't think about that as a kind of activism that's very sort of selfish, like who I'm interested in seeing my work. But I find that there's always a sort of power dynamic, and there's a politics to kind of everything that you're doing. So people who say that they're not political have the privilege of thinking that they're not. And so for me, that's not even really a question. But it is about finding different spaces, and how can I sort of change, like with a museum or something, how can I really push that to, like, working with MoMA or something, which has a very rigid way of operating and getting a project through. But how can I change that space and who is showing up there and how people are interacting in that space and interacting with each other, and conversely, like bringing. I work a lot with NTS Radio, which is like a radio, like a pirate radio station in London, and sort of doing art projects with them. That's a mostly like pretty dedicated like music audience who aren't necessarily thinking about visual art in the same way, but I've done a number of sort of like audio projects that are released as records, and going out. It's a different distribution format, kind of like Edgar said. Different ideas, to me, support different formats, and it's about also thinking about what would be best for that project and who can see it.
Okay. So, because we want to have the opportunity for all the audience to ask questions, can I get a yes or a no, either one of you? And then if you can sneak in your own answer when the audience asks your question, please feel free.
Well, I just rethought, but I would say no, but what makes art relevant is its engagement in kind of political, social context. And you can choose to do, maybe you don't choose, but art can either be good or bad. So it's not going to be good if it's not socially engaged, politically engaged.
Okay.
I mean, I just been wondering what it means to be political and what it means to have a politically oriented practice, because I think the obvious answer is like, oh, you're an activist, right? But I actually think art functions on a level that's political even before that, which is essentially what can be said, who's allowed to say something, who's allowed to participate, and I think it also art makes the world legible in a way that is hard to understand. So the artist helps us understand reality in a way that you can't actually be talked about, for example, or it doesn't exist on a kind of institutional level. I mean, it's got a nest within an institutional system, but I think art's political in the non-obvious way, and you can be very political and not even know it.
No.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the. But we are going to get to hear a lot more because we're going to have an opportunity to hear from you and have you ask questions. So I know that you do have a lot of questions, and if you don't, Edgar can say more than no. There are mics on either side, so please go to the mic and ask your question.
And can the mic be brought to them, or do they have to go to the mic?
Okay, Edgar, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say they could just skip using the mic, and then we could just repeat whatever they were going to say.
For the footage.
But
for the video.
I have a question.
Play the video.
So do you want the mic brought to you? Is that what it is?
Oh, yeah, we have one person.
We have someone here.
Yes, I have a question. One of the central insights of the 20th century was that observation changes reality. You know, all the way back to quantum physics, that the very act of looking changes something. And then postmodernism is the idea that everything is mediated by who is doing the perceiving or who is setting the rules. And then this goes back to something that I think that you said, Chris, is that all we have to do is to rely on our own truth. But the question I want to ask is, how does this not slip into solipsism and narcissism, where the only thing you're doing is watching yourself watching yourself create?
That's a good question.
Can I I give a crack?
take that one.
Give a crack at that
Yeah.
Edgar said he wants to take that one.
It was to Chris.
one? Mr. Chris, Chris, if we want, go ahead and take it.
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think, I don't know how to answer it other than personally, which is that's true. Like being aware of your own relationship to the world, your potential for your own narcissism, the potential for your own blind spots is part of that. The consciousness that you're talking about of being an observer and that actually affecting the reality or the context of the situation is also an awareness. I think, like Martine just brought up a comment about the idea the option to not be political is in itself a privilege. And the whole idea, the notion of what privilege we have and how we operate is something we all need to be aware of. But I don't think seeking out your own truth and operating in whatever practice or creative field you are in is inherently a narcissistic thing. But I don't know, I'm curious what other people think.
I was going to say that, well, it is a good question. I mean, because there's a kind of a catch-22 in there. But I try to think of it like this. I think that as creative people, we essentially have two masters. One is to our content, whatever it is that we want the work to be about, whatever issue that we want it to address. But the other master is the form itself, right? So I don't know if we have any Christian rock fans in the audience, but most Christian rock is pretty lame because they advance the content over the form. So they're like, it doesn't need to be great rock as long as we're saying Jesus every other stanza, right? But I think that if what you're trying to do is to advance a vision and a kind of engagement with the discourse, with the field, you have to be honest with yourself. And you have to be personally engaged in it because it's through your investment that the audience and the viewer would then be able to connect to it emotionally as well. Because, if people were faking the funk, right? I mean, lame musicians come to Detroit and then they leave, in a wheelbarrow because you come here and, you mess around and, they kick you out of town, You can't come here and mess around, you gotta, yeah, that's right, yeah, that's it.
But I also think it's sometimes you are going to fail and it will be self-indulgent and narcissistic, and that's fine. You just got to try more. It's like people not having difficult conversations because they're going to feel uncomfortable. It's like the point is to be comfortable with that discomfort.
Does the very consideration of post-truth eliminate objective reality and a concept of material reality versus, say, idealism?
Can you
in a philosophical sense.
Can you say that just in a slightly different way? Can you rephrase it? Yeah.
There is such a thing as objective reality of material existence that runs counter to a sort of elastic truth. And I am wondering, in your considerations of the concept of post-truth or the validation of such a thing as post-truth as we have recently experienced, does that not fly in the face of actual materialism? I guess it's a kind of Hegel kind of thing.
Go ahead, Chris. You go ahead and take that.
Take that one.
I think you guys should get on stage.
Where's the philosopher in the house? I think it's such a difficult.
One of the things that Donald Trump's tweets, the functions of his tweets are to do what's called preemptive framing. So if something happens in the world, and then his tweet basically polarizes the argument, so that there's not another kind of debate that can happen. So the thing that happened in Las Vegas, for example, the preemptive framing was to bring up any legislation against guns is to politicize a tragedy, right? So that was a kind of preemptive framing that then forces things to view either to go to one side or the other, right? So, but it also is meant to deny the very framework that you just described, which is there is a thing called the truth, and it exists in reality, and then you have things that are not true. But that's not they're trying to operate just above that, right? So like you don't have to then think about the fact that a bunch of people died, and they died because of guns, and there's been 275 mass shootings over the last 273 days within the United States, right? And people were shooting each other, not using knives. So it is guns.
Yes.
So I'm going to listen for some more answers first, but okay. My question is, when it comes to listening to the context, or, I guess my curiosity is, at what point do you consider localizing what truth means? So, for example, if you're working on, maybe not so much on a musical where you're trying to convey a particular story from a set of people, but when it comes to an architecture project, at what point do you consider what people understand as the local reality, especially when you're coming from a discipline that often encourages you to create from something new?
I can speak from an experience we had with the LGBT campus in Los Angeles, which was the act of listening is extremely powerful, and I actually think, since from our own point of view, not being like a young architecture firm, that in a way we're still exploring our own voice, our own interests within the kind of realm of architecture, and that actually has allowed us to actually listen more. Because it's not like we try not to come to these projects or these locations with assumptions about what it is people need or want or expect. And we've realized the more we can suspend our own judgments or our own preconceptions, the more able we are to actually understand what the real issues are and what the real needs are of a particular community that we're not a part of necessarily. But at the same time, we also, we are architects, so there are certain ideas that we bring to the table which we think may be possible solutions or responses. It's actually interesting today when we were touring around, I forget his name, but he was part of a community group, and the idea of working with a particular community, identifying a need, and then the difference between a response and a solution, which was a huge revelation for me, because as an architect, we always are kind of jump to create solutions. And I'm really kind of fascinated about what is the difference between a response and a solution, and how do those two things manifest themselves differently.
But don't you find in the experience of working on a building that if you're engaging with a constituency, oftentimes what they say they want is not actually what they want?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, I mean, it's a complex thing, because I think there's that. People don't even know what architects do or what they need, or, that's one end. On the other end, as a designer, you come in with an idea, and it's very hard to understand everyone's reality. there's like architecture does not exist in a bubble. You're working with other people. You have an idea, someone else builds it, someone else uses it, then someone else uses it. It's sort of unending in terms of what that context is and what that truth is. It's not singular. And I think that's what makes, it's hard to know what that local truth is, like how specific it can be, if we're going to use the word truth. But I think that's what makes, and part of it, you have to come in with an idea about your own ideas and test those against the situation, but you also have to be willing to be open that you're probably going to be wrong and might be wrong, but maybe you also have something that has value. So I feel like architecture is just like an exchange,
sorry.
But I'm also curious about Edgar's, your experiences too, as an art practice and engaging in doing architecture and working in Watts and the obstacles that you encounter. It's always a challenge, I think.
It's a curious question to me to talk about truth in relationship to architecture. It's not like an organic fit, really. But if I were to reframe that, which you're not asking me to, but if I did.
Cool. You're on the stage, so, you can do.
Yes, right, I can do it, But I was thinking about consensus in relationship to reality as opposed to truth. Because, if you're building something, you have to mitigate the tensions amongst different people. But, ideally, when you get to a form of a final design, that it reflects reality, and that reality is constituted by varied opinions that agree on their difference, right? So then that's how you can then move forward with the design. That is reality. Mm-hmm. That is Donald Trump's reality is not that. His is singular. It's not consensual. That's funny. It's not consensual on any form. Consensory. We're make sensory. Yeah. We could go all day with this poetic stuff.
But I think it's an interesting point because going back to what you said earlier about do people always know what they need or want? And I think the case is sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I think part of the role of art and architecture is actually to put possibilities on the table that people can't think of on collectively or whatever. Yeah. So there is a part of it that is acknowledging the reality exists, but then there's another part of it of saying look, there's another possible reality that we can invent, collectively. And I think that's the real, the power of what's possible.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. I don't know if this is so much a question as a statement, but some of us were talking before the program started, and none of us had met before, and all of us just jumped on the subject of how stressful the world has been since the November election. And what I'm taking away from tonight reinforces the fact that when I want to just escape and not wake up every morning thinking, oh my God, what is this man going to tweet today? What is going to be today's catastrophe? I go to the DIA and I take a deep breath and I realize I don't care what anyone's politics is who is here with me enjoying this beautiful art. And so I guess I just really want to thank you and thank Culture Lab for putting this together, because I think this is a really positive way to just look at this issue that we're all drowning in these days. So thank you. That's really all I wanted to say, was we appreciate
Hi. I have a question for Martine, and I guess this everyone else can answer as it pertains to them. But so I'm a techno producer and dance music DJ, and I find myself. I know you mentioned the sort of trying to creating things that trick people into thinking that it's an artifact that you found rather than created, and maybe that it's older than it is. I noticed the LA Club Resource T-shirt in in the pictures from your segment, and I think Delroy Edwards is a producer who's very much kind of involved in the same thing. This sort of there's, maybe you describe it as, I would describe it as like a almost retro movement in dance music, but to sort of make things that sound old, because there's this missing of that sound, except, you know, with sort of like tape hiss and analog sounds and everything, that people feel has been lost, but at the same time, a lot of people doing this were too young to experience that era of dance music in the first place. And so I often struggle with this as someone making music, because you want to do something that's of your own time, but maybe on some more emotional level, you're drawn to things that come from before that you may not have experienced. And then you have, because you can't really be there, you have this imagined understanding of what was going on maybe 30 years ago that then informs what you're doing now. So I'm wondering, and basically I guess I'm saying I get uncomfortable with that in my own work, and I want to produce something that's more of the present. So yeah, I'm wondering if you get uncomfortable with things like that, or how you deal with that, how it factors into your work. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, my background, I mean, has always kind of been from film, like even with an art context, but I've studied filmmaking, and that's sort of what my skill set is sort of around. So I think about those things as material that's deployed for a specific reason, in terms of really trying to talk about a place or a time or a setting. So if I'm using a photo from a certain time period, or I'm making it look like that, it's like a part of the larger, I'll just call it narrative, even if something's like non-linear. And then as far as the concern of something being like inaccurate or nostalgic, usually that's rooted in a pretty deep research process, so it's not my kind of romantic view. Even for this project, this film I just finished, this Instant Sweaters and Ice, I was really thinking a lot about the Great Migration, as specifically in the Delta and around kind of Clarksdale, Mississippi, and that musical history and that's connection to both Detroit and Chicago kind of house techno. And I was kind of really, I haven't spent any time there. I have a lot of family that's from there, but I hadn't spent any time there. And part of making it present for me was really being down there and not imagining what it was like in some past, or what I had seen photos of. And I think kind of bringing something into the present, or like you were talking about with Ben when you met him, and it's very important for you to bring that into the present, or understand what the reality of that is, kind of what you're talking about too, of there are these historical inheritances and traces and after images from these economic, social, historical occurrences, but I think seeing them firsthand, and for me, if I'm then going to try to capture something in terms of texture or image, I need to experience that. So that was a part of that, and then talking to people firsthand, and then having documents, so that it doesn't, it's not about a nostalgia, it's really, I'm using it for a specific reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hi there. Given the naming and the framing of this series, Post-Truth and Alternative Facts, you know, it's clearly kind of referring to this current political moment of disinformation and propaganda that we're seeing, that, you know, it's been kind of said that this idea of post-truth isn't new, but at least in the current political moment, it kind of, to me, conjures up a resurgence of fascist tactics, and and that's kind of the climate that we're living in. And so, you know, seeing the 4chan, the online back channels of just like, you know, the Russian hacking of Facebook, all of this just like quote unquote fake news, we kind of see alternative facts as a tool of fascists, or as a tool of oppressors. And I guess I'm asking, do you ever feel like straitjacketed by any like moral obligation to truth, or like given that like throwing facts out the window is kind of a tool of oppressors? Do you see yourselves in opposition to that as like on the side of truth, or is just, you know, is there still any value to any like alignment with objectivity? Does that make any sense? Or you know, is it really like whoever controls the narrative wins and it doesn't matter what's true? Is that what we've been saying all night? I don't know.
You know, the Make America Great Again is a powerful metaphor because it uses nostalgia to bring an idealized past into the present without ever fully articulating what that means, right? So is that like Happy Days where we weren't allowed to eat in the restaurant, but like we were outside? It's like, is that what we're conjuring up? You know, like what point of American greatness is he bringing into the present? And I think that's probably more about what is at the heart of your question, which is, how do we live in the present right now with a sense of agency where we feel as though the things that we do and the things that we say actually matter? Right? And even to a greater degree, the question is not only does it matter, but can I trust that it is going to matter well into the future? Like, is it just all relative? And when you have a society which is based on relativism, or at least moral relativism, then that's the time when fascism can move through the door. And that's essentially kind of, that's the tide that we're in, and that's the reason why you're sort of like, does truth matter anymore? Even though you're standing here in the room drinking a beer and I can see you. So clearly you're real. Does everybody else see him? He's there, right? Okay. Yeah, there you go. There's your basis for truth. You exist. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's like sort of like, are you asking me how it matters in my work, like in the studio, or is it for me as a person, like living? Because I think, yeah, there's a material reality that I, as a person moving through the world, encounter. But do I, when I'm working on something, am I like, yeah, I don't know, it's kind of like, yeah, I'm employing fiction, which is another word I think we could use, like in my films.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe this idea of truth or objective truth, you know, like, I mean, I think right now, the context we live in is very reactive. I think it is a race for the microphone. It's a race to be the first one, and the president employs this to control the narrative with these fragments or with these statements. And then I think the tactic is to get everything riled up. And I think that's the kind of circumstance we live in. It's a kind of super activated context in the world we kind of live in right now. And I think, I mean, personally, what I was sort of advocating about for finding a ground is to try to, like, at least on some level, say that it's not always about this kind of race to control the narrative, but to try to figure out what actually is meaningful and how your work is meaningful. So that's what I was trying to talk about in terms of finding a ground or finding a personal truth. But I think also, like, to this point, what we do as artists or architects or whatever is we're also creating narratives, because it's important to have a narrative that actually moves something forward. And what do you hold that up against? Who scrutinizes that narrative? Because that narrative, I mean, they're very false narratives, and I think there's very questionable things. Like, it comes from a place of what is that narrative leading you? We have the alt-right, which is about a marginalized community that thinks that their version of the world should be what it is, but it's driven by fear and hate and, you know, a slew of like a lot of crappy things.
Self-entitlement.
Yeah.
This is ours.
Yeah. There's other ways, I think, to pursue it that's more about compassion or understanding or a kind of relating to other people on a more fundamental level. So, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but...
Why are these people, everybody's asking these like deep philosophical questions. What's going on here? Like, what happened? You know what I mean?
It's like, going to go there.
Oh, I know, right? I'm like, we were not prepared for these questions.
Okay. Yes.
And this is Detroit. This is real. This is the D. I'm impressed.
I'm kind of coming from left field. I'm a nurse who works in intensive care, and every intensive care unit that I've worked on has been a locked unit. So I see a lot of death and suffering, and it's locked away. And as family members come in and they see this death and suffering that I see on the daily, which is my truth, they're shocked. Like, how is this happening? And that's kind of how the hospital structure has been set up for a while. We kind of put away things that aren't nice to look at. So what I'm wondering about this idea of post-truth is, when I see my family members and my patients, and it's not really, their truth has changed, it's deepened. So I'm wondering if we're just kind of in this, if you think we're just in this transitional time of deepening and broadening truth, rather than like the woman in the head wrap that said, like, are we denying objective reality, or is it we're just kind of understanding objective reality? We're like kind of like waking up to objective reality, and I think the suppressors of that may be like Donald Trump being like dismissing that, oh, well, that narrative isn't real. So but really that's like, are we in a time of post-truth, or is this just a shifting to broadening truth?
Should we open this up to the audience to take a crack at that? You want to say something? Post-hegemonic.
Right. What truth is that? Is that if you look at post-truth in a positive way, it could be that it's no longer hegemonic. There's not one truth. It's pluralist. So that's kind of what
Did you hear that?
I think so. So not one truth.
She said that if the truth is post-hegemonic, meaning that it's singular from the state, this is what happened, but now other types of perspectives are being validated as well. Was that in a nutshell what you were saying? That the media, we're woken up to the fact that the media is not,
which it never has been.
That.
Yeah. So in a way, it's
Well, I'm kind of countering that it is a singular reality that we're all coming to, like, slowly, but like with my example of, like, people have been dying and suffering for a long time, and they are right now. And then, but once you look it in the face, it's like, it's this jolt. And I'm rather than like this pluralistic idea, like, I think we're just trying to understand reality as we're awakening to it. Is that? It's also a question, I guess.
What do you think?
It's also a sense that we're waking up to the values and ours managed that how xenophobic, how racist, how anti-immigrant this America is. Well, there's many people in those very communities who say, well, thank you for waking up, and it's always like this. So it's not like we've entered some age where all these
Did you guys hear that on that side? Essentially, she said, that what's happening is that the world is becoming aware of the people becoming more aware of other people's realities because of that these traumas have been going on for a long time. But now we're aware of it, and that it's affecting all these communities, and now everybody knows that it's happening.
I have to go.
So I think this concept of post-truth, where we're valuing feelings over facts, came from the media pushing and responding to sensationalism. And I think that our political regime right now uses sensationalism to gain power and will use it to keep power. So as artists whose role is to reflect society upon itself, do you find a struggle in not using sensationalism in your art, or do you feel like you kind of have to fight fire with fire?
Do you guys want to take that?
I don't know if it applies to what
I
we
don't
do
think
as
it applies
artists.
to architecture.
I'll try to give a crack at it. I mean, there are certain things that supersede trends, and there are certain kinds of modes of expression that can move beyond just kind of the immediateness of the moment, even if it's like a decade of Donald Trump. And I think that those things are archetypes. There's certain kinds of story structures that are, like within the music of Beethoven, for example, like he really hated trends. So what he tried to do was to rely on certain types of archetypes in his music, which is in the beginning he was dealing with loss and trauma, right? He was dealing with loss and love, these kinds of things. And I think that for me, what I try to do as a producer is to try to focus on things that can touch people both in the immediate sense, but to also give them a sense of like both the archetypal past as well as the transient present, right? You sort of somehow want to put people within the spectrum of those two things, right? None of us want to reproduce a sense of hopelessness in the work that we do, That tends to be my strategy to try to avoid that. Philip Johnson, you said? Yeah.
Philip Johnson, he was like so enamored with the aesthetics of like concepts, and that's why he was kind of in bed with fashion.
Yeah. I mean, but Philip Johnson was enamored with power too, and aesthetics were things that he cared more about. And I don't know, like I think it emanated from his personal, in that example, What's interesting?
Yes.
I'm actually curious, as creative people, and I think it applies also to architecture, and we're talking about post-truth and what is, what's real truth and objective truth and all this. As creative people, have you had situations where your message or what it is you're trying to do has been taken and someone has gone and created a post-truth out of what you've done, where you've had to deal with perhaps the complete opposite of what your intent was? And how did you deal with that?
It almost seems inevitable, right? Because whatever you put in the world, people are going to interpret through their own lens, right? So at least from my point of view, if you're not, otherwise it becomes propaganda, right? Because the idea is propaganda is basically supposed to like promote one singular truth, and the interpretation of it relative to someone else's reality, that's very different than art, right? And I think ultimately you can't control the way people relate or understand, at least for a building, right? And actually that's actually the most amazing thing about it, right? Is it opens up any number of ways of relating to it.
Well, I'm saying, like, in terms of, construction is maybe meant to bring people together, but it becomes a symbol of gentrification and the destruction of neighborhoods and communities, and then that becomes what you represent. Has that happened? And how do you deal with that?
I think that's a reality. That's, to put that on the shoulders of the architect, that's an economic and social, and it's a situation that's bigger than like any one person. And in a lot of, speaking personally, like, I don't think we've built enough projects to have experienced what that outcome is. But it's something to think about. It's something that weighs on every, in our field, in my field, weighs on everybody about what it is, or not everybody, but I think it's an important issue. There's this sort of sense of, well, improvement, if it's, bringing about change, it's always perceived as sort of negative change. But I think it's about trying to figure out what are ways in which it's not perceived as negative, and I don't know if that's purely can be done through design.
But there's a bigger question there, Cornelius, and the bigger question is how much of individual intention matters within the scheme of what you're describing, which is gentrification and displacement. Because, within our economic system, investment incentivizes investment. So let's say an artist moves into this neighborhood, they start to fix it up. A cafe says, hey, we love what you're doing. We want to move in too. We want to make some money. And then another artist moves in, and then it organically grows. And then some developer comes and says, hey, we love what you're doing. And then you have this thing of displacement. But that's the thing, is that the individual intention at a certain scale can't be fully responsible for the entire gestalt, right? So there's some analysis of the tendencies of the systems themselves that's worth analyzing in there too.
Yeah, but I thought of an example kind of an institution I worked with that was not very supportive of the project that I was doing and had sort of told me one, budget, gave me another one, so on and so forth. It was a very difficult process. And then after the sort of project went up, was using my image and using my work as sort of example of how supportive they were of like black women, for example. And although their collection, their staff, and so forth did not reflect, and nor the way they distribute their money did not reflect this kind of PR campaign. And I've found maybe that more in terms of the more visible I become, the more this question, because there's obviously still an economic disparity, even just in terms of a wage gap that is very real in terms of the budgets that women artists get versus male artists. And combine that with me being a black woman, the budget that I'm getting is not the same as somebody else. And so I feel like, but there is a real incentive to make me extremely visible and be used by various institutions or magazines and so forth. And that's something that I'm really just figuring out how to deal with, because my impulse, my desire is to then be invisible. Like, I don't want to be seen. Or, it's like, how do you kind of control that image? But I think it is this kind of structure that is larger than you in a way. And I don't know, it's something I'm really navigating. I think one thing I found is in terms of the way that I make work, and I've always, as I sort of outlined these projects I was a part of, but the way that I make work is very much driven by my own values and who I choose to work with, how I choose to compensate people, how I choose to credit people. All those things are driven by my own values, and being very transparent, sort of vocal about that side of it. But that's something that happens a lot of, everyone wants to use your photo, but they don't want to give you any money. Yeah. And sometimes I am very aggressive about not letting them use my photo, or then that becomes the thing that I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to charge you for that. Like, you know, sometimes it's just an argument for the sake of making this point that I engage in that. But I feel like it's a conversation that's really important, especially within collecting institutions or the way that these things get historicized. You know, where if it's trendy to have, like this sort of United Colors of Benetton in the annual report, then it's there, but that breakdown is not present in other ways.
Well, please join me in thanking the